A gavel struck the desk so hard the water glass beside it trembled. "Ma'am, this is a courtroom of law, not a shelter for people who can't keep their paperwork straight." Grace Whitman stood at the podium in a blouse she had ironed twice the night before, her hands folded so tightly her knuckles had gone pale. She hadn't slept. She had spent the entire night rehearsing every sentence she was about to say, running through them in the mirror, in the shower, in the car on the way over. And now, standing in front of the one man who could decide the rest of her son's childhood, none of those sentences would come out right. "Your Honor, I just need 30 more seconds to." "You've had 4 minutes," Judge Holloway said, not even looking up from his notes, "which is 4 more than most people get in my courtroom." A few soft laughs came from the gallery. Not many, but enough. Enough for Grace to feel the heat rise up her neck, enough for her to want to disappear into the floor, enough for her son's future to suddenly feel like a joke being told at her expense. That laughter was about to cost the room far more than anyone realized. Grace worked 2 jobs. Mornings at a diner off Route 9, on her feet from 5 a.m. until the lunch rush finally thinned out, and evenings cleaning office buildings downtown long after everyone else had gone home and turned off their lights. She hadn't missed a single custody payment in 3 years. She hadn't missed a school pickup, a parent-teacher meeting, a single birthday. Her son, Caleb, was 7 years old, and every decision she had made since the divorce had been built around one simple question: what keeps him safe, fed, and close to me? But her ex-husband's new lawyer had found a loophole, a technical filing error from 18 months ago, buried in paperwork nobody reads twice, and today, in front of a packed courtroom, he intended to use it to take her son away. According to the filing, the opposing lawyer said smoothly, straightening his jacket with the practiced calm of a man who had never once had to worry about rent, Ms. Whitman failed to properly register her change of address within the required window. Under Section 4, subsection B, that constitutes a material breach of custody terms. Judge Holloway nodded along, already halfway to a decision he hadn't fully read. "That does appear to be the case." "Your Honor, I moved because the old apartment had black mold," Grace said, her voice cracking down the middle. "I have the health inspector's report right here. I filed everything, I just filed it a few days." "A rule is a rule, Ms. Whitman." The judge's tone was flat, almost bored, like he'd said the sentence 1,000 times before and had long since stopped caring what it cost the person standing in front of him. "I don't have time to bend the law because life got complicated. Everyone's life is complicated." He reached for his gavel. Grace closed her eyes. In her mind, she was already picturing the drive home, the empty passenger seat where Caleb usually sat kicking his feet against the dashboard, the silence of an apartment that would suddenly feel too big and too quiet. And that was when a voice came from the back row, calm, unhurried, the kind of voice that didn't need volume to fill a room because it carried the weight of certainty instead. "You're reading it wrong." Every head turned. An older man stood slowly near the back, dressed plainly, a worn brown coat over a gray sweater, the kind of coat that had clearly been through many winters. He looked like nobody in particular, the sort of man you'd walk past at a bus stop without a second glance, the sort of man whose presence in a room people simply forgot to question. He had been sitting quietly through the entire hearing, arriving before Grace, before the lawyers, before even the bailiff, and no one had thought to ask why an old man in a plain coat had chosen a seat in the back row of a custody hearing that had nothing to do with him. Judge Holloway's jaw tightened. "Sir, this is not open for public commentary. Sit down." The old man didn't sit down. "Section 4, subsection B doesn't require registration within a fixed window," he said, his voice steady, patient, the voice of a man who had explained complicated things to frighten people many times before. "It requires notice within a reasonable window, contingent on habitability. There's a carve-out clause, paragraph 3. Most people skip it because it's easy to miss if you're not looking for it." The courtroom went very still. Even the ceiling fan overhead seemed to slow. "And how," Judge Holloway said slowly, each word sharpened like a blade being drawn from its sheath, "would you know that?" The old man walked forward, unbothered by the stares now fixed on him from every row, his footsteps the only sound echoing through the room. "Because I wrote it," he said simply. 31 years ago, back when I sat where you're sitting now." A murmur rippled through the gallery, quiet at first, then spreading like water finding the cracks in stone. "My name is Arthur Bellwether," he continued, stopping at the low wooden rail separating the gallery from the courtroom floor. "I sat on the state appellate court for 22 years before I retired. I wrote that carve-out myself, after a woman very much like Ms. Whitman lost her son over a filing technicality that had nothing to do with whether she was a good mother. It broke something in me, watching that happen and knowing the law itself was the thing that failed her, so I made sure it would never happen again. Apparently, somewhere along the way, people stopped reading it." Judge Holloway's face had gone pale. He reached for the thick statute book resting at the corner of his desk, flipping through its pages with hands that were no longer quite steady. hands searching for something he suddenly wasn't sure he'd find, or worse, was afraid he would. Paragraph 3, Arthur said quietly, right there. The judge read it once, then again slower, as if hoping the words might somehow rearrange themselves into something more convenient. They didn't. The ink sat exactly where it had sat for 31 years, patient and unmoved by anyone's discomfort. This changes the entire basis of the filing, he muttered, almost to himself, the certainty draining slowly from his voice like water from a cracked glass. It does, Arthur said, which means opposing counsel's argument doesn't hold. Ms. Whitman filed appropriately, under the exact protection the law was written to give her. The opposing lawyer shifted in his seat, suddenly very interested in his own notes, his confident posture from moments earlier folding in on itself. But Judge Holloway wasn't finished being wrong just yet. Pride, it turns out, is a slow thing to put down even when the evidence is sitting open on your own desk. Even so, he said, straightening in his chair, trying to reclaim some authority in his voice, this is highly irregular. I don't know who you are, sir, and I certainly don't take legal instruction from a stranger in my gallery. Arthur nodded, entirely unbothered. That's fair, you don't have to take my word for it. He reached into his coat and placed a small card on the clerk's desk, his movements unhurried, a man who had long ago stopped needing to prove himself in a hurry. You can call the State Bar Association. Ask them who authored the 1994 custody reform package. Or, he added, glancing toward Grace, whose eyes had not left him since he'd spoken his first word, you could simply read the paragraph you skipped. Either way works. The judge stared at the card for a long moment, then at the statute, then finally at Grace, who was still standing at the podium, tears now openly falling, no longer from fear or humiliation, but from something closer to disbelief, the strange, dizzy feeling of watching the ground shift back underneath you after you'd already braced for the fall. The laughter from earlier had gone completely, permanently silent. Judge Holloway cleared his throat. It was the sound of a man realizing, in real time, in front of a full courtroom, that he had spent the last 20 minutes humiliating someone for being poor instead of admitting he might simply be wrong. The court, he started, then started again, his voice noticeably smaller than it had been an hour ago. The court will take a 15-minute recess to review the relevant statute in full. He didn't wait for a response. He stood, gathered his robe around himself, and disappeared into his chambers without meeting anyone's eyes, his footsteps quick, almost fleeing. Grace sat down hard in her chair, her legs no longer able to hold her upright. Arthur walked over and sat beside her, not as a stranger anymore, but like someone she had somehow always known, in the way certain people feel familiar even the first time you meet them. Thank you, she whispered, her voice barely audible. I don't even know how to. You don't need to thank me, Arthur said gently. I owed a debt in this courthouse a long time before you were born. I just finally got to pay it. Grace blinked, wiping at her eyes with the back of her hand. A debt to who? Arthur smiled, and for the first time, something in his composed, careful face softened into memory, into a place he clearly hadn't visited out loud in a very long time. Your father, he said. Grace went completely still. 40 years ago, I was a scared young man on trial for something I didn't do, Arthur said, his eyes drifting somewhere far past the courtroom walls. Standing in a room that had already decided I was guilty, not because of the evidence, but because of where I came from, the clothes I wore, the way I talked. Nobody wanted to take my case, it didn't pay. It didn't look good on anyone's record. Except one public defender, a tired man with far more cases than hours in the day, who looked at me like I was still a person worth defending and said, everyone deserves someone in their corner. He worked nights preparing my defense when he should have been home with his own family. He believed me when absolutely no one else would. His name was Robert Whitman. Grace pressed a trembling hand to her chest, her breath catching sharply in her throat. That was my father. I know, Arthur said softly. I recognized your last name the moment the bailiff called this case this morning, and I recognized your eyes the second I saw you standing at that podium. You have his stubborn chin, you know. He never backed down either, not once, not even when it would have been easier. He passed 4 years ago, Grace whispered, tears falling freely now. He never talked about work at home. He always said everyone he helped because it was right, not because he wanted anyone to remember it. That sounds exactly like the man I knew, Arthur said, a quiet warmth spreading through his voice. So today, I want to be clear, I didn't come here as a favor. I came here because 31 years ago your father gave a frightened young man a chance nobody else in the city was willing to give him. And I've spent every year since then trying to make sure the law does the same for people like you, people the system too easily forgets. Today, it just happened to be his daughter standing at that podium. I like to think he'd find something fitting in that. 15 minutes later, almost to the second, Judge Holloway returned. He looked different now, not broken exactly, but humbled in a way that changed the set of his shoulders. the kind of humbled that comes from a man realizing the floor beneath his certainty wasn't nearly as solid as he'd built his career believing it was. I have reviewed the statute in full, he said, his voice noticeably quieter than it had been before the recess. The carve-out clause clearly applies to Ms. Whitman's filing. The claim of material breach is dismissed in its entirety. Custody remains unchanged. He paused, and for the first time since the hearing began, he looked directly at Grace. Really looked at her, not through her, not past her toward the next case on his docket, but at her, as a person standing in front of him with everything to lose. Ms. Whitman, I owe you an apology. Not only for the ruling I nearly made without fully reading the law behind it, but for the way I spoke to you before I understood your situation. That was beneath this bench and frankly beneath basic decency. I'm sorry. Grace nodded, unable to form words, tears still slipping quietly down her face, the good kind now, the kind that comes after fear finally lets go of your chest. Outside the courthouse, the afternoon sun had broken through the clouds that had hung low all morning. Grace stood on the wide stone steps with Arthur beside her son's school photo still clutched tightly against her chest, the same photo she had carried into every hearing for 3 years like a small piece of armor. I don't know how to repay this, she said, looking up at him. Arthur shook his head slowly. You already did. You showed up every single day for a boy who's lucky to have you. That's the only payment that has ever mattered to me. They stood there a moment longer, two strangers who weren't strangers at all, connected across 40 years by a man neither of them could thank anymore, but both of them clearly still carried with them. We spend so much time judging people by what they can't afford, a lawyer, a suit, the right words said at exactly the right moment, that we forget dignity was never something you could buy in the first place. Sometimes the person the room laughs at is the one who's been right all along. And sometimes the stranger in the back row isn't a stranger at all. He's simply a debt, quietly waiting decades for the right moment to finally be repaid. If this story moved you, hit subscribe, because next time it might be someone you'd never expect who changes everything.